I've learned that build it and they will come is one of the biggest fallacies in tech.
Welcome to Nerd Out at Spotify, where we bring you behind the curtain of the world's most popular audio streaming subscription service. Machine learning, open source, clouds, tabs versus spaces. We'll talk to Spotify engineers about interesting tech issues, big and small. I'm Dave Zolotuski, principal engineer at Spotify. When you're a Spotify developer working on a platform as big as ours, you have a lot of different users to consider. Not just listeners, artists, and podcasters, but also other developers. From hardware companies building smart speakers, to car manufacturers building infotainment systems, to hobbyists coming up with the next cool website or app. There are thousands of developers out there building great Spotify experiences. They just don't all actually work at Spotify. We support this developer community through APIs, SDKs, and other developer tools. We want to make sure that building for Spotify is as great an experience as using our products. But how do we know we're doing that? How do we know we're providing the tools these external developers actually need to create great Spotify experiences? Well, to start with, we become their first and best customer. Then, we make sure they have a voice that can be heard among our internal development teams. And we use the tools we build for them ourselves. We do all of that through our developer advocates. These are developers who work at Spotify, but who are listening closely to the needs of those developers outside of Spotify. And we're talking to one of those developer advocates today. Hey, Sarah, can you introduce yourself and describe the work you do here?
Yeah, sure. My name is Sarah Njambi Kiburu. I am Senior Developer Advocate here at Spotify. My team is responsible for Spotify for Developers, and that's primarily the work that I do, interface with developers and enable the work that they do.
So you said Spotify for developers. I've heard of Spotify for artists and Spotify for podcasters and like a dozen other Spotify fors. What is Spotify for developers?
So Spotify for Developers is this developer portal that we use to publish all the public APIs and SDKs and libraries that we want external developers around the world to use to extend the Spotify experience in the contexts in which they're in. So our partners will come onto the developer portal and they will find these APIs, and they will also find the documentation that my team puts out together with these APIs and the guides and the sample code to use alongside it, so that they come from idea into an extension of the Spotify experience in no time at all.
Awesome. So but I guess before we keep going, just really quickly, where is all this stuff? Like if I wanted to find it, where would I go? How would I find it?
Yeah, so the developer portal is on developer.spotify.com, and all the resources on there are public and can be accessed by anyone.
Awesome. That sounds super easy. That is a great URL. How did you get into this role? I mean, it sounds like a fairly kind of unique thing to be doing. How does one get there?
Yeah, developer advocates have very different journeys into their careers. So my background is in computer science, and my first role straight out of campus was with a nonprofit in Nairobi, and my role was as back-end engineer building open source tools to help journalists make sense of open data that government would open up and be able to tell data-driven stories and create data visualizations with it in no time. So I did that work in open source as a backend developer for the first year. And this one time I went and spoke at a conference where journalists were essentially talking to them about a tool I had developed. And after that conference, the response to it was very positive. And my boss at the time said, maybe we should get you to interface with the people that use the tools you build a lot more, in addition to the backend engineering work you do. So we tried to find a title for my role, and developer advocate seemed a good fit. I moved to a different organization called Open Knowledge Foundation. Still nonprofit, still open source, doing the same work, this time in Europe and South America. And then I moved into a new role in open science and open data, where my work was still developer advocacy in an organization that was interfacing with people who are already experts in their roles, so scientists and researchers, but who find themselves in a world where they have to learn how to code. And so the carpentries will write open courses to teach them how to code in Python and R in the different scientific research fields that they're in. And so after those 2.5 years at the carpentries, Spotify was looking to set up a developer advocacy team. So I joined a little over a year and a half ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome story. I think the one piece I wasn't sure if you touched on, but I think you're in Stockholm now, right, at Spotify?
Yes. I missed
How did
that.
you end up in Stockholm?
So this career of mine has brought me through a really interesting journey. Like I've moved countries, not so much, but quite a bit. So I was in Nairobi at the start of my career, and somewhere in between, I moved to Tallinn, Estonia, where I was for 5.5 years for my roles at the Carpentries and Open Knowledge Foundation. And now, with the new role at Spotify, the organization was very keen to bringing me here, where the head offices are. And who could say no to Stockholm with all the nature trails there are and the waterways and everything? It's absolutely beautiful. So that's how I found myself here.
I see. That makes sense. Yeah, I think a lot of people at Spotify end up being in Stockholm at least at some point or for some time. And not a lot of us have talked about how we end up there. I mean, I spent over 5 years in Stockholm too. So I can agree with much of what you just said.
Yeah.
But, all right, let's jump back a little bit to you were describing what you did. I think you said that your title was a senior developer advocate, if I got it right?
Yes.
So what does that mean? What are you advocating for?
So developer advocates are under the broader umbrella of developer relations. Once we've built the tools that we want people to use, sometimes our intended audience for these tools, for these APIs, these libraries is other developers. And so it's important to have a bridge through which to communicate to them and make sure that they, one, are privy to these resources, but also that they know how to access them and that they're able to use them successfully to achieve what it is that they want. Now, there's a couple of roles under the developer relations umbrella. The first one is developer advocacy. Once you've put out resources to people, the main goal is knowing that the person it is intended for is able to use them to do everything they need to. And if in case they're not able to, the developer advocate is responsible for listening to them and then taking back all the wish lists that they have for, missing requirements or places they would want this tool to go to so that it does more to speak to their use case. Taking all of these wish lists can be considered in future versions of the tool that are put out. So that's where the term advocate comes from. I'm listening to developers and then advocating for their needs to the rest of the engineering team that I work with. Other roles that exist are around evangelism, which would mean once we put out a tool, our main work here is to go out and tell people, hey, there's a really cool thing we built. You need to get in on it. And if you don't, you're missing out. And then there's other roles in there as well, community managers who are responsible now for the day-to-day communications. Hey, I'm using your thing, it's not working. And then they respond. But in most cases, you'll find the primary goal is that the feedback element is core to the work we are doing. We want to make sure developers have the best possible experience as they work through their developer journeys and incorporate the tools we're putting out for them as part of their developer workflow so that they're successful.
It sounds a lot like a product manager sort of role, like getting to know what the product's intended for, making sure they're able to use it, they get their things done, bringing their feedback back, things like that. How does this differ from a more typical product management role?
One of the core pieces of work that we do as developer advocates is customer zero work. Our entire team are engineers by training, so we're able to dive into the code and build the things ourselves. We're able to dive into the code and fix issues ourselves. But more than that, the most important thing is for all the resources that are being built by different teams, it's important to have someone who's almost always one step removed from the development process to test it out first before it goes out to the broader audience that you have. most times when someone is very near and dear to the development process, there are things you begin to miss. So if you have someone like us, developer advocates, who are one step removed, come and test your thing, then we're able to tell you right off the bat, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with your resource, right? Doesn't make sense on its own. You need to provide more context to it. So customer zero work is really important, and it's something that we embark on. And I think that's one of the primary differences from product management.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that really helps me see a little bit more of the difference there. So then tell me a little bit from a Spotify point of view, like for the company, why is this such an important, valuable thing?
Right. I think for a long time, we've thought about Spotify as a resource or a tool that will enable everyone around the world to enjoy music and have access to music and all these things. But at the core of it, people have a myriad of experiences around which they would like to ingest and enjoy all the content that we put out on Spotify. A lot of these experiences are built around their cultures, right? Or around their everyday work life. And so, for a product that primarily improves the lives of people, you want to make sure that you are enabling them to improve their experiences in the way that is meaningful to them. But if we were to do that ourselves, we would have a 1,000-mile long list of things to do, and there's not nearly enough engineers to prioritize that work. So how do you enable the masses to do what it is that is important to them and in no time at all? So this is a core reason for which we exist, right? We could easily have a mile-long list and wait forever for it to be done, or we could enable 1,000 people to do the different things they want to do at the same time. So sort of like a many-to-one mentorship type model, to borrow from that, and sort of have 1,000 wins at the same time.
And I guess you said we a few times. We never touched on this, but how big is this team? Like, what does the team look like?
Right. This is a really good time to ask that question. Up until October, we were a team of 4, and we are now a strong team of 8. So we have a designer on the team and 7 developer advocates, which means we prioritize work and assign it to different people so that everyone gets to wear a hat at any given time, from communications to technical writing to writing code samples and everything in between, maintaining the developer portal itself. But the good thing about having everyone very well versed with all of the work that needs to be done is there's almost always someone able to step in and help, or step in and review, or just collaborate with each other and get the work done. So it's very fluidly organized right now and on purpose. And I think we're having some really good wins so far.
Let's talk about some of the developer tools and stuff. So I think you talked earlier about developer.spotify.com and some of the products there. Can you just tell me a little bit more about kind of what is there, and then a little bit about how the stuff that is there came to be?
So the developer portal has been around for a while. The current version that people see in January 2023 has been there since 2018. And before that, there was a version that was set up way back when, a little before 2010, to give people access to libraries as they came about and APIs as they were opened up to the public. And later on in the quarter, there will be a revamped version of the portal. So thereabouts February, March, people will look at a new version. So in there, you'll find libraries like the Web API, which is by far the most popular API that allows people to access endpoints about tracks and artists and everything in between. And so a lot of the popular apps that we also showcase on the developer portal are built on top of Web API. We also have the Web SDK, Web Playback SDK, and it's a library that allows everyone to enable the playback experience on the web. And there's a few other libraries in between. There's the Ads API, which is our most recent one. And this is very exciting because it gives developers a way to interface with the Ad Studio, which is where people are able to log on to and manage the ad experience if they are serving ads via Spotify. We also have information about the commercial hardware. So all the speaker-oriented stuff and how to get started with our embedded software development kit to make that experience possible for the different speaker devices that our partners work with. Yes. So there's a lot of information in there and a good place to find information about all the things that used to be available but are now no longer supported is through the news channel. So our blog talks about why and when we deprecate things. So that will be a really good first stop if people are wondering about things.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of those libraries and SDKs, they make sense, like why there's Web API, why there's Web SDK, and things like that. How do you kind of know what to put on the site? Like, I don't know, some team at Spotify builds this new API. It obviously has some use cases. How do you decide whether or not it belongs on developer.spotify.com? And if it does, what belonging even means? Like, you don't just put a link to a GitHub page, you put more.
Yeah, exactly. I think the answer is usually if your resource is meant to be used by partners or by an audience outside of Spotify, and if your audience is technical, then the developer portal is almost always the right place for it. I'll give an example. Ads API used to be served via its own standalone website, and they will share the link with people via email or the forums in which they were, but that wasn't a really good discovery point. And so allowing everyone to have one point of discovery for all the resources that Spotify intends for the external developer community is a really big win. And that's the goal of Spotify for Developers. So the one question in the rubric, is your audience external? Is your audience our partners? Will the information be public to all? If the answer is yes, then we put it out on the developer portal. But then we decide we need to put it on the developer portal. But before it gets there, there's a certain standard we aim for. So we want to make sure that one, when people come to your landing page for your resource, they're able to make the decision about whether or not your resource is the right thing for them to use, right? Is this API the best one for the purpose I'm looking for? And so there has to be right off the bat those really good intro, getting started docs that give a lowdown about what this is, who it is intended for, what it does and does not do. And once they're able to make that decision, you need to put out things like guides that show them what is an example of a thing I can do, a small win I can have from start to finish. And once you show them that, then you give them extended guides that show them how to achieve the more complicated tasks. And of course, document, if it's an API, all the endpoints are documented at length, complete with the error codes and everything, so that someone is able to have this self-serve experience, which is, I came onto Spotify for Developers. I made the decision that this is the best for me. And I used the idea I had and the documentation that's on there to come from idea to an app or extension that actually works with minimal input, if at all, from the Spotify team. But where they're unable to work without input from us, we also give them access to the developer forum, which is where all developers convene and are able to answer each other's questions, but we also keep track of it and are able to answer their questions from time to time.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So there's like a community of users of this that help each other. And then also you're in there as the Spotify voice in that community, but oftentimes the community helps itself. That's really great. That sounds very kind of open source community as well. That's cool.
Exactly. I'm really proud of our community, especially because it's grown organically. So the developer forums are also where all of Spotify users convene. And so it's a subsection in that wider forum where developers come and talk to each other. And almost always, I can guarantee you, for every new question that comes in, we'll actually see other developers jump in and try and answer the questions. And sometimes we need only step in when, they're unable to figure it out themselves. So it's very good to see how organically it has grown over the years. And it also helps because people get unstuck quite quickly. So it's really important to keep the conversations moving and have people winning. One of my favorite parts of that forum is where people share the their wish lists. So all the ideas they have for what we should do with the APIs and the libraries in the future, so that they're able to do more for them as a community. So people type out their ideas, and then the rest of the community is able to upvote these ideas. And I think there's a current rubric around it where if the upvotes meet a certain threshold, so a certain number by the 6-month mark, then they are escalated to our team so that we're able to consider them and take them back to the engineering teams responsible for building and maintaining the product, so that they were then considering these ideas and use cases, because clearly a lot of people are upvoting them. There's reasons for it, and there's conversations usually under these ideas, people asking clarifying questions, people building on the idea. It's a really elaborate, beautiful ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, so I guess it's not like you're promising you'll build things after so amount of votes, but they kind of get an an advocate, for lack of a better word, within Spotify that will at least nudge teams towards building it. That's really great. That sounds like an awesome community. One thing that's maybe similar to this makes me think of, I think I've seen a few libraries or SDKs on the developer page that either weren't built or maybe even still aren't owned by Spotify. I think I remember years ago I was playing with Spotify from Python, and I played with something called Spotify, which I don't believe Spotify created. Are there a lot of these sorts of things? How does that sort of thing kind of come to exist, but then get listed on an official Spotify page, but maybe isn't owned by us?
Yeah, I like that you brought that up. And this is, I think, part of what you were saying, that it all feels very open source ecosystem-y. And so it's this idea that when people see a need and the opportunity to make that come to life because they have the expertise for it, they're really curious about it, they want to experiment, then they go out and do it. And sometimes you build out an experiment and then it becomes really important to a community, and you find yourself becoming a community manager around it. That's how open source works. But we also are really keen to recognize such efforts, and it's a big reason why we showcase a lot of these libraries built by enthusiasts in the community, built by third-party developers in no way affiliated with us. We also want to make sure that developers don't spend a lot of time building a thing and then it goes against our policy. And so we have to shut it down. So there's policies written out and spelled out clearly so people know what is within bounds. And if they're doing or abiding by the policies and enabling the work of many other people in a way that also benefits us as Spotify as part of the ecosystem, we just showcase them so people can easily find these use cases and use them rather than think about developing from scratch, right? Which will take them a lot more time. So the goal here is just to enable people and empower them to do their best work in no time at all and with as few hiccups as possible.
Yeah. No, that's really great. I don't know too much about this community, but it sounds like another one of these kind of awesome communities on the internet to kind of to be a part of, to get to know how to build things, to work together. So
yeah,
that's cool.
Yes. Yeah, so you mentioned a Python one. There's also a really popular Ruby one and a very popular R one as well. So yeah, and they're all showcased there. It's very cool to see.
Yeah, that's great. I think then the other extreme of this, at least in my head, maybe you view this community differently, but there are obviously some really big companies that use Spotify technology, whether it's, I don't know, game consoles like Sony or Microsoft, or car companies like, I don't know, like Volvo or Volkswagen or whatever, some much larger company that all also integrate, or I don't know, like speaker companies like Sonos, Bose. How do they interact with this? I imagine that Sonos doesn't just like jump onto developer.spotify.com, download some things and speak in the community, or like Volkswagen or someone. Like, how do they get into this whole thing?
Yes, there's a really important role that I didn't mention, and it's the role of partner engineers. So for bigger partners, there is existing relationships built on trust between teams within Spotify and teams on their end, because these are really big collaborations. And so that is handled at a more intense level, I feel like. So you're right that they will seldom, if ever, maybe they might chance upon it and decide to use our Spotify APIs instead of other APIs that they've been using, maybe that are offered by our competitors for one reason or another. Maybe that's one stop, right? But once there's an existing relationship, that partner engineers who then help them do the integrations, who answer all their questions hand in hand with their engineers to bring the integrations to life. So all of that relationship is really important to have and exists for these bigger partners.
Like a really good way to kind of summarize some of the things you opened up earlier. You talked about experiences that Spotify can't build into the app, but that customers really want.
Yeah.
One thing I was really curious there is like, how do we ensure that a lot of these experiences at least feel like Spotify, that kind of similar, cohesive to what an end user would expect of the Spotify experience?
In the developer portal, there's a section called Docs. And right before we dive into all the resources that we offer, the APIs, the SDKs, all of that, we start by giving people guidelines. So what does it look like to give your app some of the look and feel that we would want you to have if you want to have a Spotify emblem, right? Or how do you make authorization possible so that your app is secure as you build it? Or, so design guidelines, authorization guidelines are in there. And very soon we'll add accessibility guidelines. So what all these guidelines are, they're just a blueprint to help developers make sure that they're meeting the Spotify standard as they extend the Spotify experience elsewhere, because it's a big responsibility. You reach a wide audience, and so there's beyond look and feel, there's also an experience you want to afford people. So if everyone can be afforded the same optimal, high quality experience at the end of the day. So we put out all these guidelines and keep updating them. But more importantly, we have a team internally at Spotify whose main goal is to review all these apps that are being built, particularly at the point where they have a lot more users. And so there's more than 25 API calls per minute, for example. Then we want to hold these apps accountable and the people that develop them accountable. So this team at Spotify will look at whether they are adhering to the developer policies, whether they're meeting guidelines in all the ways that they need to before they're allowed to go over the minimal calls per minute that we allow for beginner app. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of things that people are building, like some of these same sorts of things we started talking about. Do you have some examples of just some really amazing products, or maybe like personal favorites of things that you've run into in the community built on top of these tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest ones that's used everywhere is Magic Playlist. So what Magic Playlist does for you is it allows you to specify where is it that you are and what it is you're doing at any particular time. And then what it does is it creates a playlist for you to be able to do your favorite activity without having to spend time skipping through music. So essentially, you're doing music discovery, but over a long period of time. So if I wanted to go on a nature trail for 5 hours, I could easily use this and get to listen to all new music based on my tastes without having to skip through things. So that's one of my favorite ones. There's some really interesting ones that just borrow from people's curiosity. There's one that was built by a Spotifyer, actually. It's called Every Noise at Once. And maybe a question for you before I tell you about this one. How many genres of music do you think there are, right off the top of your head?
Oh, I think I recently had a conversation about this. This may be cheating, but I feel like it's orders of magnitude more than I thought. It's like thousands, like 5,000 to 7,000, I think was the answer. But I think Spotify used to have dozens, and like every couple of years it grows in order of magnitude, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so there's about almost 6,000 right now. And that blew my mind because I could barely get to 10. I know that's really wrong. But yeah, so when I learned this,
I don't know if I could get to 10.
Yeah, it's 6,000 sounds like a lot. And they update this regularly, right? So the app is called Every Noise at Once. It's a website that you land on. And essentially, you have to scroll, and they're sort of clustered, I think, by similarity. Or if you wanted, you could view it as a list. And every time you hover over each genre, then it plays a sample of that music. And it just blows my mind. I think it's one of my favorite uses and displays of data that Spotify has, but also a lot of data in general in a way that's fun, easy to discover. So I think that's actually my favorite one of them all.
That's very cool. That sounds like it would make an amazing demo. What about internal Spotify teams? I mean, there's a ton of stuff that we build at Spotify.
Yeah.
Do internal teams use the same stuff and maybe don't go to the external developer site, but kind of is it all the same APIs and SDKs that are built into our own products and effectively the same sort of support that you provide to external teams that they need?
Yeah. So in some ways, the products that they use are the same as external developers, and I'll explain that use case. And then in other ways, no. The tools and resources are completely different. So in the first case where Spotify engineers actually get to go onto developer.spotify.com and use all the resources we have on there is primarily around Hack Week, right? Which is this really fun experiments week we have at Spotify, and people discover what other engineering teams are doing. And most times they'll end up using these APIs in one way or another to deliver their Hack Week projects. And so it's usually very fun to be able to hear about these use cases and also how they end up building out new things completely using resources that are available to external developer audiences as well. But internally, for all the things that don't end up on the external developer.spotify.com, a lot of the use cases we support, a lot of the apps, APIs, libraries where we run developer relations and developer advocacy work more specifically are around developer productivity. So all the tools that Spotify engineers build to make the work of other engineering teams at Spotify and product teams at Spotify faster, more efficient, to make delivery easier are things that we support engineering teams to do. So it's a lot of things around documentation, customer zero work, testing things over and over again to make sure that a Spotify engineer will discover this thing and use it on their own without having to know who you are as a team that built it or maintains it, and be able to use it start to finish and give you feedback and have that responded to quickly or incorporated as part of your roadmap, if possible, in no time at all. Yeah.
So you mentioned Hack Week. I've seen posters that I think your team puts up, like around Spotify offices and mails we sent out or posts we sent out internally to try to get people within Spotify to play with all these tools during Hack Week. Are there kind of awesome Hack Week projects you've seen come out of this? Like what sort of stuff has come out of those efforts?
Yes, a lot of really good ones have come out of it. I think one of my favorite ones last year was one that would allow you to specify what kind of workout you were doing and then just have music match your tempo through and through. And it would, I don't know, they did this really cool thing where your camera would monitor your movement. And so as you got tired, the music slowed down to match you. And in some ways, I thought, I don't think this will help people. They'll feel really bad because if music slows down, you're sort of being reminded to go faster. But I thought that was a really cool hack. And they used Web API for that, just to figure out, just watch movement and then have music match tempo and then slow it down in some cases. That was really cool to see. I think one of my favorite ones.
That sounds super fun.
It is. It is a lot of fun. I think one of my other favorite use cases is where people use Hack Week to see whether they can move away from their old ways or the things that power the tools that they build or are responsible for and move towards adopting one of the libraries or APIs that are also used by external developers. So a lot of those don't culminate in here's a thing or a proof of concept because a week is a very short time, but it's usually very interesting to support people and see them run these experiments and at least come away from that week with some of their big questions answered, because they normally wouldn't have time to dedicate to such experimentation outside of their roadmap if it wasn't written in.
Yep. I always think when I see those, like, what comes of this stuff?
Yeah.
So I'm glad that there are at least some super fun projects that come out of that. I guess the other side of working with teams internally is I imagine that there are a lot of times where you get requests, whether it's from partners or from the community or anywhere else, and they're not just an API thing. It's like functionality that needs to happen deeper. How do you work with the rest of Spotify to get work done so that some third party can create something?
So I think it's really important to note that a lot of the requests and wish lists that will come in, unless they are small enough that the developer experience team that I sit in is able to dedicate some time to it and develop it ourselves, a lot of the time it's going to be a long-term conversation. And what that means is teams are already tasked with work that is really pertinent to the business. And so they have roadmaps set out for a while to come. And so when we step into the space to talk to them about these new requests that come in, the answer is almost always no, not right now. We'll see where to fit it in. And sometimes the items on the wish list are very exciting that they're able to say, wow, yes, we need to think about that. But almost always the answer is not right now, maybe at some point down the roadmap cycle. So it takes time. And even when we get to build out the thing, we have to think about how to fit it in a way that makes sense, not just to Dave's use case, right? Because we serve a global community. We have to go back and look at related requests and then say, okay, it looks like the broader ask from all of these requests could be this, and it will serve a wider audience. And so what comes out of it might not necessarily speak to your use case 100%, but it will definitely cover a lot more people's use cases, which is more beneficial to us as Spotify. It's how many people can we enable with one push, right? And then sometimes if the answer is no and we don't even know when we'll work on it, it's good to be honest with people and why we are able to point them in a different direction and say, this is a resource that could speak to your use case, or just tell them and really quickly too, because it's important for people to get that feedback, no matter positive or negative, quickly. Tell them, no, we're not able to build this, not at this time, and we don't know when, but we have noted your request. And that empowers them to be able to go out and find solutions on their own or recalibrate. Yeah.
Yep. I think with all of this, the most important thing isn't building it. It's ensuring that everyone has the right expectations and they know what's happening. So that makes a lot of sense. I really wanted to ask you this question. I want to ask you what you've kind of learned from all this work about writing great APIs and great SDKs. Like, are there kind of specific things that you know you can look at and say like, well, this one's not very good, or like, this is a great one?
Yeah. One of the most difficult lessons, but one I really wouldn't miss a bit in sharing is I've learned that build it and they will come is one of the biggest fallacies in tech. It's really important to listen to people who will be in your intended audience, and as often as possible to be in the spaces where they convene. So if you convene that space and are able to ask them questions that will help guide your building from scratch, that's really important to do, and really early on, and then often during your development process. And listen to people's needs, and then build for those needs rather than all the things you would wish to have out in an app. So build it and they will come is a very risky affair and seldom as rewarding as centering your audience, your developer audience right off the bat. This is why the API-driven development that demands that you listen to your developers and how they will use the API is one of my favorite approaches for API development. So yeah, so that's a big lesson. And then the other one is definitely because we're in tech and everything changes so quickly, it's really important to just always remember you'll always be in class for as long as you're working in tech. And so have a growth mindset. Be ready to, just learn new things, recalibrate, experiment a lot, but also fail. That's the reality of experimentation. But when you fail, talk about it, what went wrong, document it especially so that people who come after you and have similar ideas will know that you tried this and it didn't work and this is why it failed. Therefore, if they try this again, they should maybe switch the context in which they try it so that they don't make the same mistakes as you. So growth mindset, and be willing to share your experiences, good and bad, as you go with other people. Yeah.
Yep. That's really great. I was largely expecting you to have some, I don't know, like tech answer of like, I don't know, don't use whatever, I don't know, enums in this weird way or something. But I think everything you said makes a lot more sense. And like, here's 3 like things I expect in a proto file. So no, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was awesome. And it was really great talking to you.
Thank you, Dave, sorry.
Either one. What else are you nerding out about aside from APIs to stream music?
I don't know. Geeking out about robots. I don't know. I don't think they'll be the future per se, but being careful just in case. So learning my way around them this year.
I was going to ask you, what does geeking out about robots mean as you're actually doing, if you're doing it as a just in case they take over the world sort of thing?
Yeah, so my just in case for robots is learning how to put them together, because if you learn how to build a thing from scratch and make it possible for it to do things, you can disable it just as easily. So that's my plan there. So let's see how we do.
I will call you if we get into trouble here.
Yeah, find me.
Thanks for listening. Hit that follow button, and we'll see you right back here, unless there's a robot apocalypse. Nerd Out at Spotify is produced by Spotify's Ted Vergakis and by Seaplane Armada, who also wrote our groovy theme song. I'm Dave Zolotuski. Thanks for nerding out with us.